Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Part B material from week 0. Let's go ahead and get into it. So Part B is going to cover these 4 topics. First topic we're going to talk about is strings. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about this print word that you've seen in that program that we last wrote. Then we'll talk about variables. And then finally we'll wrap up with more input and output. And I say more input and output because print itself is a form of output, but we'll get there in a little bit. Alright, so before we talk about strings, I want to talk about the idea of a type. So every value that you use in your code, basically any noun that you use, any piece of data, it's going to be categorized into some sort of data type. So the type determines 2 things. It determines 1, how the data is stored in the computer, how it's internally represented and stored internally. We're going to talk more about data representation next week, but do keep that in mind for now. The type also determines what operations you can perform on that data, meaning what can you do to this specific piece of data? Can you add to it? Can you subtract from it? Maybe if it's a number type, that would make sense. So if we go back to this first program that we wrote, we have a couple lines of comments, this print hello world, which we saw displayed the message hello world on the shell for us. This text in green right here, this hello world that's surrounded by quotes, this is what we call a string. So a string is going to be the first type that we talk about in this course. Strings are basically sequences of characters. So characters can be letters, numbers, special symbols. The space character is also a character. Basically, whatever you would type in as a word, for the most part, those are going to be strings, which are made up of characters. So again, looking back at our Hello World example, that is a string right there, because it's a sequence of characters. So as you saw in that Hello World example, strings are surrounded by quotes. This is pretty common across most programming languages. Something to keep in mind, you can use either double or single quotes for strings. The book uses single quotes. That's totally fine. I typically use double quotes. That's also fine. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to do. There will be cases where you will want to use one or the other, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, just keep in mind that you need to surround strings by quotes. Something to do, keep in mind though, is that the quotes need a match. So for example, if you start with a double quote, you need to end with a double quote. So in this second bullet point here, these 2 hellos are not considered strings because those quotes don't match. So just make sure when you're typing strings in Python, you're being consistent about what form of quotes you use for that specific string. Again, you can either use double or single quotes. Doesn't make a difference to Python. We're going to talk about numerical types next week. So something to keep in mind as we go forward with this class, types are going to be something that comes up a lot. Types, again, those are sort of the nouns or the data that we have in our code. So at this point, you should be a little bit familiar with the string type. Next week, we're going to talk about numerical types, specifically numbers that we can perform math calculations with. That said, let's go ahead and quickly revisit that previous example that we were talking about, this Hello World program that we wrote. So we've seen now that these first couple lines of code, those are comments. Those are just for the human's benefit. This print hello world we know now is a string. Let's talk about this print statement though. So print is a special built-in ability that function has. It's what we consider a form of output. It's output because it displays something on the screen, right? We saw when we run this code, the message hello world comes up in the shell for us. That is a form of output. So print, again, it's a special built-in Python ability, and you've seen it in action already. So the way print works is you type the word print, and make sure it's all in lowercase. The case does matter. And then you do open close parentheses. This is a very common thing. We're going to talk more about what these open close parentheses mean in a couple of weeks. And then inside of it, you give it a string. So in this example, we have two print statements. Something that's pretty cool about print is once you do a print, anything within that print statement will be on its own line when it's displayed. So in this example, we have two things that we're printing. We're printing North and we're printing Seattle, and we're printing them using two different print statements. Because of that, when you run this code, on the screen you'll get this out. You'll get North and then on a new line Seattle. So by default, the content in each print statement is displayed on its own line, which again, it's for convenience. It's pretty cool that it does that. Another thing you can do, if you have multiple pieces of data, so let's say for example you have two different strings, you can print multiple items using one print statement. And the way that works is you again type the word print, all lowercase, you have your open and closing parentheses, and then you can type in your different pieces of data. So in this example, we have two strings again. We have North and Seattle. Those are two different strings. I know that because of where the quotes are. And because we have two pieces of data, we have to sort of separate them. So Python knows, all right, here's this one, here's that one. So you can separate multiple items in the same print statement using commas. And the way this works, by default, when you print 2, 3, 4, you can add in as many pieces of data into this print statement as you want, separated by commas. By default, the way it'll come out on the screen is wherever there's a comma in the output on the screen in the shell that comes out, you'll get a space. So again, by default, you can print multiple items in the same print statement. You separate them by commas in your code, and then when they're displayed on the screen in the form of output, they'll be separated by spaces. So these two lines of code, they essentially print the same thing, right? So in the first line of code, we have two different pieces of data. We have one string that contains North. We have another string that is Seattle. And they're separated by commas. You get that displayed out. In the second piece of code, you're going to get the same thing displayed, but it's stored a little different internally. So in this case, there's only one string that we're displaying with this print statement. The whole string is North space Seattle. So since we're not using that comma, we do have to explicitly type in the space character ourselves so that that space is shown when we run it on the screen. But these two lines of code essentially do the same thing in terms of output. There will be cases where you won't be able to do this second example where you know what both the strings are in advance. So there are reasons where you might actually have to separate stuff by commas. We'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, just keep in mind that you do have a little bit of flexibility with the print statement. Again, print, for now, we'll see print just printing strings. In the future, we will talk about how we can print other types once we talk about those other types. But for now, you should feel okay about using the print statement and using it to display strings on the screen.